Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. Domestic abuse is an issue that we as a community continue to grapple with. In our series, Controversial Issues Related to Women, we'll explore this topic further. Does the Quran support domestic abuse? Do we need to rethink this issue from an Islamic lens? Let's sit down and talk to Dr. Shabir Ally to learn more. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So we're discussing controversial issues related to women. We're talking about domestic abuse. So given that we say, Islam is a religion of liberation for women, why is domestic abuse a controversial topic?
Well, domestic abuse in the past was very common. Many of the rights that are given to women nowadays are recent developments in human history. So we shouldn't be surprised if you go back to a past civilization and find that domestic abuse was common. Now, how did the revelation of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, try to change this situation and bring people out of that mindset in which they think that it's normal for a man to beat his wives? First, we should recognize that the Quran could not change everything overnight. It is well known among Muslims that the Quranic revelation was gradual, and the instructions from God were also gradual, given a bit at a time, to the extent that it is classical in Muslim books to note that even the prohibition of alcohol was given in gradual stages. At first, it was said only that alcohol is both good and bad, and so use your judgment in a sense. And then later on, it is said, okay, if you drink, well, don't come to pray. And so the idea is that if people want to come to pray, they'll realize that drinking is like antithetical to praying, so that's a bad thing, and they will kind of leave it off. Then eventually the full sanction of the law is registered in saying don't take it at all. Now it's ruled to be prohibited, and that remains the lasting legislation. But although it is known through such narratives that the law of Islam was gradually introduced, what came to be thought as well is that as the Quran finally was left with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, this is the final culmination of all of the rulings, and everything stops right there. There is no further development of human thought, of human understanding, and of modification of some of the laws as they have once been left by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, either by his personal example or in the Quranic revelation. And so what is the result of this is that whatever the Quran did not address, or the Prophet, peace be upon him, did not quite correct, that has remained as it was. And whereas some things were left for later generations to improve upon, as the circumstances would allow, we did not allow it, even though the circumstances have changed, and the circumstances do now allow for these improvements in terms of the development of rights of women more generally.
So let's talk about a verse in the Quran that people use, or I guess I've heard people use, that supports domestic abuse. So I'll leave that with you.
Well, while I will concede right away that there are hadiths which do concede or do allow for men to beat their wives to a certain extent, and I'm glad we've dealt with problematic hadiths more generally so that we know how to conceptualize and how to frame these hadiths within that broader study of taking a balanced approach to hadith. But when we come to the Quran, there is no verse in the Quran that actually sanctions a man beating his wife. And the verse that is commonly referred to in this regard is misunderstood, and I should now explain that. The 4th chapter of the Quran, the 34th verse, is really speaking about state authorities intervening to provide guidance and correction when women in particular pursue sexual activity outside of marriage, especially in the area of prostitution. But of course, the Quran is not limited in its legislation to women. The Quran gives similar warnings and sanctions against men as well in other verses. But the Quran is so constituted that it does not treat of a singular subject continuously in one place, but rather in a scattered manner. So you might find one verse in one chapter dealing with something, and then another verse in another chapter dealing with the same thing. And in order to understand what the Quran is saying about that thing or that topic or theme, one needs to gather all of the verses from disparate chapters and put them together, and then connect the pieces to see the whole Quranic viewpoint on the subject. So,
sorry, just before we go further, can you actually give the translation of that particular verse that you were talking about?
yes, it's easier for me if I start with the Arabic.
Sure.
The Arabic says, وَاللَّاتِي يَأْتِينَ وَاللَّاتِي تَخَافُونَ نُشُوزَهُنَّ. As for those whose nushuz, I have to retain that word for the moment. As for those whose nushuz, it almost sounds like new shoes.
Yes.
As for those whose nushuz you fear, فَعِذُوهُنَّ, advise them, وَهْجُرُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ, and abandon them to their dwellings. I'll come back to that translation, but I'll leave it at that for the moment. وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ, and beat them. فَإِنْ أَطَعْنَكُمْ فَلَا تَبْغُوا عَلَيْهِنَّ سَبِيلًا. But if they obey you, then do not seek any way against them. إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيًّا كَبِيرًا. And certainly God is above all, and He is great. Now, if this verse is put in its context within the same page in which it is written, what we find is that the very next verse, that is, now I'm referring to chapter 4, verse number 35. The very next verse, this verse number 35, is clearly an address to the Muslim community as a whole, and the commentators say that what is being instructed to the community will be fulfilled by the qadi, the judge, or the imam, the leader of the community, because such a community work cannot be done by the individuals. It has to be done by like a state authority. So what is being commanded in Surah 4, verse number 35, it says, وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ شِقَاقَ بَيْنِهِمَا, and if you fear a breach between them, فَابْعَثُوا حَكَمًا مِنْ أَهْلِهِ وَحَكَمًا مِنْ أَهْلِهَا, then send forth an arbitrator from, or a mediator, from his family and from her family. And then the rest, so that if they desire to have reconciliation, then God will open the way for them and so on.
So
Okay.
the idea is not, it's just not individually between husband and wife, but rather sort of a community affair.
And of course, the instruction as to who should be carrying out the measures is given to the community as a whole, but to be instituted by the state authority in the form of a judge or an imam. When we realize this, and the narrative is continuous, if you fear, from verse number 34, and if you fear, from verse number 35, it's obviously continuous. If you fear this, do this. And if you fear this, then do this. So once the narrative is so continuous, and we recognize clearly that the addressee in verse number 35 is not a husband, but a qadi or judge or an imam, the leader of the community, who is to administer the measures that are given, then the commentary that has been given to Surah 4, verse number 34, that resulted in the idea that a man could beat his wife is entirely wrong. Because in the first place, that verse is not addressing husbands. For that idea to work, that this verse is saying to husbands that they can beat the wives, then the verse has to be addressing husbands. The verse has to say something like, oh, you men, if you fear this nushuz from your wife, I'm coming back to the nushuz sounding word, if you fear this nushuz from your wives, then do these things, including beat them. But the verse is not addressing husbands at all. The verse is actually talking about men in the third person. It started out, but when you asked me for the translation, I actually started from within the verse. But the beginning of the verse says, الرجال قوامون على النساء. Men are to be protectors and maintainers of their women. And so men are being spoken about in the third person. It's not, oh, you men, be protectors and maintainers of your women, and then if you fear.
So you're saying that's sort of a general statement, and then this is isolated, but it's actually related to the next verse.
It's actually continuous, very much related to the next verse, but within the same verse in which it is mentioned, Surah 4, verse number 34, it is clear that men are being spoken about in the third person. And the only way that verse would mean that men could beat their wives is if men themselves were being addressed.
Directly.
Directly. And to say that in Arabic is very easy. The Quran could have said, Ya ayyuhar rijal, in khiftum nushuz zawjatikum. If you, O men, if you fear the new shoes, the nushuz of your wives, then do this. In fact, the verse doesn't even mention the word for wives in Arabic, which would have been zawjat. The verse mentions nisa. And nisa means women in general. In a context, it can mean wives, true. But generally, Muslim scholars interpreting the Quran have adopted the principle that a word should be taken in its general meaning unless there is some reason for restricting the meaning. So now, without prejudging the issue and finding a reason for restricting the meaning, taking it in a general way, we find that nisa could mean women in general, whether they are wives or not wives. Some could be widows, no longer wives. Some could be unmarried, not yet wives. And some might have chosen to remain unmarried. Well, they will never be wives. And so all of these are women with no husband to beat them. So the idea that this verse gives permission for men to beat their wives is incorrect. So what is more correct is that the state authority is being addressed and is being told that if you fear this nushuz, now I'll come back to this. This word nushuz, without going into great detail, can mean the same as fahisha. As when we link verse with verse, we see that the same idea is mentioned in other verses within the same chapter. Surah An-Nisa, the 4th chapter of the Quran, we see from verse 19 onwards that there is this idea of sexual promiscuity and what's to be done about this. It seems that the same thing continues into verse number 34 here. And the state authority is being directed, if you fear that women are doing this, then first you give them some advice, and then if that advice is not working, then you place them under a sort of house arrest, and if that is not working, then the third stage is the corporal punishment. Now, of course, nowadays corporal punishment for sexual crimes is a debatable issue, and this needs to be discussed by Muslim scholars. But in the time of the Quranic revelation, this was common. It is known from the biblical tradition that people may be stoned. We have in the New Testament a woman being brought to Jesus, accused of adultery, and the question was, who will cast the first stone? But the idea that the ancient law allowed for a woman to be stoned in this sort of situation or under this sort of accusation, and not only women but men as well, but women were more often accused of this, especially if she turned out to be pregnant outside of marriage, then the proof was assumed to be against her. But the idea that this was an ancient biblical law was not questioned. And when Islam came on the scene, it is known that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, generally followed the Jewish lead on law, unless something was specifically revealed to him in the Quran counter to that. And we know, in fact, that the Quran did actually reveal lashes instead of lapidation, instead of stoning, in the 24th chapter of the Quran. And so it seems that something of this nature is what is mentioned in Surah 4, verse number 34. But there could be various stages of violation of the law, and Surah 4, verse 34 is addressing various stages. So at one stage, maybe just a warning will do. Another stage, a house arrest will curb the problem. But a third stage might require corporal punishment, given that context at the time. So if we are to now put that in very concrete terms in our present context, let's say in a certain state, prostitution is banned. how might a state then enforce its own prohibition? Let's say there's a red light district, and there are some people there, whether men or women, are standing there and selling themselves. Well, the police may come and issue a ticket, which is a warning. So that's the first stage, the warning stage. Let's say that person, despite getting the tickets, maybe even a couple of tickets, that person still is present there at the scene and apparently plying the trade. Well, then might come the next stage. The person may be placed on a kind of a house arrest, or at least he is restricted from coming into this area. So that's the restriction or the quarantine. And then the third stage would be a greater level of punishment, maybe imprisonment in our present context. That's how a modern state would deal with enforcing their anti-prostitution laws, where these laws are still current. So something like this is what this verse is talking about. It's not about men beating their wives, but of course that had been a common interpretation, unfortunately, and that has led to many people asking about this, and Muslims themselves have trouble with the idea that a man could beat his wife.
I think you ended off and wrapped that up very beautifully, so thank you very much, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.